Welcome to the XT Podcast, your ultimate destination for valuable insights, practical advice, and inspiring stories that will transform the way you experience business, governance, and life. Join your host, Ashutosh, as he dives deep into three distinct editions: Customer Experience Edition, where industry leaders discuss CX strategies, product brand employee experience, digital innovations, and best practices for improving customer engagement, retention, and loyalty.
Welcome back to the XT podcast. Today's episode is one I have truly been looking forward to because it doesn't just scratch the surface of leadership or CX, it dives deep into something more personal, more uncomfortable, and far more powerful. My guest today is Chris Gillen, founder and CEO of Color-Based AI and author of the incredibly resonant book, The Villain Trap. With over 3 decades of experience leading customer-facing operations across sectors, whether as CEO of national research firm, VP of CX at a voluntary benefits provider, or heading digital ops for brands like Toys R Us, Chris brings a grounded, real-world perspective to leadership that is as empathetic as it is exacting. His book, The Villain Trap, is not your typical leadership manual. It's a mirror, one that quietly and sometimes painfully forces us to reflect on our own stories, our ego driven narratives, and the cost of blame. But it doesn't stop at awareness, it offers a way out through the hard but healing work of ownership and accountability. In this episode, we answer some deeply relevant questions. What is the villain trap, and why is blame not just a bad habit, but a power draining spiral? Can great instincts and gut led leadership coexist with introspection and journal prompts? How do we distinguish harmony from silence, especially when teams don't speak up? What if you aren't the villain, but someone else is? How do you stay grounded without getting gaslit? And perhaps most importantly, what does authentic repair look like when you realize you were the villain in someone's story? Whether you're leading a team, raising a family, or just trying to show up more consciously and conscientiously in your everyday life, this episode is a must listen. It's raw, reflective, deeply human. Let's dive in. Hey, Chris, welcome to the XT podcast.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Likewise, Chris. In fact, I've been genuinely looking forward to this one. Your book, The Villain Trap, and I will be giving the link to the book in the description. So, all the listeners, I would definitely request you to take a look and give it a read. Because for me personally, Chris, it didn't feel like reading at all. It felt like holding up a mirror,
Wow.
looking at it myself. And it wasn't preachy, it wasn't prescriptive. I really resonated with it. So, thank you, first of all, for the book. I loved reading it.
Thank you.
And also, if I may add, Chris, somewhere between those check boxes, the journal prompts, I genuinely found myself reflecting not only my on my own leadership, but also on my own personal life in terms of how I've been engaging with people all around me. There's a lot that I would love to talk to you about,
Sure.
all that's there in the book. But to begin with, what is villain trap?
Sure.
Chris, I would love to start from the ground up, and I would love to ask you specifically why the emphasis on the word trap in the first place.
Yeah. Well, Ashutosh, thank you so much. And your words are humbling to me, man. As a first time author, I've never written a book before. It's been a lifelong concept for me. But the reality of this, the last 4 years, I was compelled. I just felt that this book needed to be out there in the hopes that people like you would read it. And what I like to say is that I didn't write this to be a manuscript. I wrote it to be a manual, a way for people to figure out how they start owning their real story. And I'll talk about that. So thank you for your kind words. But yeah, the book is The Villain Trap. It's how leaders lose power through blame and how to take it back. And to tell you a little story, I grew up in a household with people who created villains their whole entire life. And look, I love my family, but they really introduced me, specifically my dad and my brother, to the idea of being consciously choosing to be a victim, to blame other people rather than take ownership and accountability. And so if it wasn't for my grandfather, which I talk about in the book, I probably would have gone down that same road as well. But my grandfather taught me a very important lesson. He said, it probably is your fault. And those are difficult words for people to hear. But the reality of what he was saying was, Look, 99% of the time in these situations, we're just as involved as the other party. We play a role in that. But the problem is our egos protect us. They don't want us to accept accountability or accept ownership. So the villain trap, and I believe it's a trap, and we'll talk about that. It's really a cycle. It's the cycle that we fall into when we blame others to avoid facing our own accountability. It's a protective mechanism. But the problem with it is when you do that, it may feel good in the moment, but it quietly steals your power to lead, grow, and to change. And that's exactly the world that my dad and my brother lived in. They lived in this where nothing was their fault, where it was always somebody else, and they could never take accountability. And that happens because blame is safe. It feels safe to us rather than saying, you know what, I messed up or I screwed up or I didn't do that correctly. And it really happens when things go wrong. Finger pointing protects our egos, but it helps us avoid the discomfort of owning our own truths, especially in leadership. And I know we'll talk about it. While I wrote the book for leaders, it really is for anybody. Right? I mean, that's the secret of the book, is that you don't have to be a leader at work, because we're all leaders in some capacity, whether it's home or in our churches, wherever it is. So it's a passion project for me. It is not about how many books I can sell. It really is hoping that someone like you reads it and gets a tremendous amount of knowledge out of it, and you can really find your true story. That's really the essence of the book.
How lovely, Chris. In fact, I must say, from my own experience of reading it, I felt that most books often refer to things and people in third person. So they'll be titling individuals with terms like customer and stakeholder and partner and vendor and so on and so forth. And what it does is it almost dehumanizes the conversation. Here, when I was reading the book, and especially Chris, because you have added these check boxes here, you've added those journal prompts, and when I was going through these, I almost quite instinctively started checking these myself, reflecting on my own journey so far and figuring out, okay, what have I done, what I've not done, and so on. So it genuinely felt what you mentioned, that it's not a manuscript but rather a manual. Was this intentional, Chris? Did you genuinely see this book as a mirror for leaders, not to read but introspect?
Yeah, and you know what, I tried to speak directly to the person reading it, because I agree with you. You feel, disconnected sometimes. Like, this isn't me. You're not talking to me. And one of the things I wanted to do is write, as you read the book, as if I'm writing the book specifically for you. And I feel like I am, because I can tell you, it doesn't matter your gender, your race, where you're from. This is something we all fall into hundreds of times a day. I mean, literally. So anybody that says, "Oh, this isn't me," you really need to read this book again, because we all do it. And the check boxes are. It's interesting that you bring this up, because I've had a couple of the people say the same thing, that they found themselves writing in the book and checking the book. And I tell you, that makes my heart so happy, because that's what I'm looking for. I actually had somebody reach out to me and said, this is a book I'm going to go read every 90 days as a refresher, as just reminding myself, am I keeping myself out of the trap? And you had asked the question of why the trap, because I referenced the models that I believed in as a young leader growing up, that kind of shaped how I lead teams and what's my approach to leadership. And you look at something like The Victim Loop by Stephen Covey, which that was in his book. It wasn't by him, but he wrote. That's where he became very famous for that. But as I thought about this, I thought, you know what? It is a trap. It's something that we fall into. Our ego traps us, is really what that means. It means that I take a trigger, something that kind of sets me off, and then I build on that. My ego builds on that and protects me in the process. And it's an easy trap to fall into, because it feels good. It's like a drug. When you do something that you did, but you blame others for it, and as a result of that, there's no accountability and there's no consequence for you, that feels really good. And so you continue to do it again. So it is very much, to me, like a trap. And the essence of the book is, how do we stay out of it?
Wonderful. In fact, let's now then unpack this trap, Chris. You very beautifully unpack this trap in this term that you call bubble, the blame bubble. And
Yeah.
here you talk about those 5 stages, where there's a trigger, an event that leads you to think, why am I in the spotlight, and especially when the focus is on your ego and insecurity and other such emotions. Mostly you call it out rightly as emotional thinking, which leads to a reflex, that an instinct that leads to creating villains. I am the hero and the other person involved is the villain, and clearly I'm not doing anything wrong. And then it clouds your judgment so that you start reading unnecessary meaning into what information you are getting, and that almost justifies your villain creation, as you rightly called out. And all of that finally leads to a lot of reinforcements, making you trapped into this mindset. I'm deliberately summarizing this because I don't want the listeners to get everything in this conversation. I genuinely want the readers to read the book. But here's the question: a lot of all this that you said, Chris, is majorly focused on interpersonal dynamics, and that's very, very important, no doubt. But can it also be used or referenced in context of villainizing or blaming the situations?
Yeah.
The leaders might blame market, consumer behaviors changed, I couldn't do anything. Tech landscape changed, I couldn't do anything. Market just changed, the trends changed, I couldn't do anything about it. Always something beyond my control, which I couldn't do anything about it. Would that be a possibility as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there's a lot to unpack there. And I
Yes.
agree. We want people to read the book because I think that's how you're going to get the most value. But this blame bubble concept is really an interesting concept, and it's this concept of the minute that you enter the trap. And you mentioned the 5 stages to the trap. One is the trigger. The trigger is something happens that creates cognitive dissonance, which is it makes me go, ooh, I don't like that, right? Because we have expectations of things, of people that are going to happen a certain way. And when we run into something where that is counter to what our mind is telling us, it's that kind of emotional, like, ooh, what is this? It doesn't feel good. It could be something that somebody says or does, whatever it is. But that's the trigger. That's the part where the trap is beginning to open. The next thing is this reflex or self-justification, where you're saying to yourself, I didn't do anything wrong. This isn't me. I was perfect. You did everything, and it's your fault and your problem. And then that's when the trap fully opens. And then the story creation begins. And we're really, really good storytellers, and we do a good job of creating stories. So what happens is ego comes in and starts creating this story for you that protects you, right? And then you get into the emotional justification. You start looking for other little things like, oh, I remember when he did this. Now I know exactly why he did it. But you really don't. It's just your ego telling that you do. And then suddenly what happens, that creates reinforcement. That's the last step, which is now you've created this story, whatever that story is. And now I begin to freeze you out. I begin to isolate you. I begin to treat you differently. It's not loud. I talk about this. We have this belief that you have to be like loud and screaming and throwing things. That's not what this is. This is quiet. It lives in quiet spaces. And you don't know necessarily sometimes that you've even done this, but your behavior change starts minimizing. I talk about minimizing the range of people. You're really you're lessening them in the process. And then to your other question, you can blame anything. And we see this, LinkedIn to me is a very interesting place. I see so many blame bubbles. I see so many villain traps opening up all over the place. You see a company that says, listen, we had bad quarterly results because of the weather. That's not to say that that's not part of the problem. It certainly could be, right? But if you alleviate your responsibility, I did everything right, and it was only because of this one thing, you've begun then the blame, the villainization of that one thing, and then you stop looking internally to see what could I do different? How could I have owned this situation? And I want people to be really clear on this. You don't just villainize people, although that's kind of the primary thing we do. We can villainize just about anything as long as it leads to us kind of getting rid of ownership and responsibility that we should be taking. It's closing our eyes to that. So those things can certainly play a role, but we end up villainizing and blaming things so that we don't need to focus on that critical introspection that we should all be focused on, because we all play a role at some level. And that's what I talk about, is owning your real story, not the story your ego is telling you, but what is the real story.
How amazing. In fact, talking about stories, Chris, your book is filled with stories and incidents. And that's another thing I loved about it, that it's not just introducing the concept, but it's pretty much elaborating on that concept with real life scenarios and stories and incidents, and I could pretty much relate to a few of those as well. And your stories made me actually far more reflective. The concept alone may not have done that work. And when I talk about these stories, and if I focus on the blame bubble itself, Chris, if we go back to the root of what's blowing the bubble, ultimately it's the ego, the emotions, the insecurity that's blowing it. You talk about the bias, the clarity versus comfort dilemma, and so on. Now here's the question, Chris. Most successful leaders that I talk to operate from the foundation of instinct.
Yes.
They don't have not as much data led. They validate their decisions or back their decisions with data. But if you ask them what led you to those decisions in the first place, they say it was just instinct. This is what I felt is right, and I
Yeah.
rallied the organization to follow me. So the
Yeah.
question is, if we make the leaders be more introspective, be far more journalistic in terms of figuring out, are they operating out of ego or not? Are we slowing them down? Are we sharpening their edge or diluting their edge?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. Look, some of the best leaders, in my opinion, are leaders that just have really good gut instinct. They have a sixth sense about them. They know, they
Yes.
kind of feel things. And look, I've in my leadership career, I've relied on my gut. And you hear everybody say, right, like, never go against your gut, because if you have a gut feeling, you're probably right. And I'm in full agreement with that. I don't think that forcing a leader to be introspective, to say, listen, let me take a step back and see how I contributed to this situation, slows people down in any process or changes their gut. As a matter of fact, I will tell you, leaders, in my opinion, that have that really good gut instinct can identify the trap opening quicker than leaders who don't, because they
Nice.
know they can read this book, they could get some of those cues. And I think instinctually they could be better at saying, wait, I think I'm falling into the villain trap. Let me take a step back and let me just reassess my part of the story, my role of the story. And I had somebody reach out to me, and it was really an interesting question. They said, well, it sometimes it feels like I have to take all of the blame for the situation, and that is not what ownership is about. Ownership is owning your part of the situation. Not you may have an employee who is just not good. Like they maybe they're a little bit lazy, maybe they don't want to work, or can't show up on time, all of that. You're certainly not going to own that. They have to own that. But what you might own as a leader, taking a step back and looking at it, is, did I train them properly? Did I give them enough information to make them successful? What is my role, and address there? And I used to coach my teams that when you remove the ability for somebody else to blame or villainize, you leave them exposed, right? And so
Right.
what I mean by that is, if you go into that situation not saying you can never show up on time and you're terrible and you don't do the things that you need to do, which just creates conflicts and reinforces the trap, right? It just really kind of grounds you in that trap, that justification. I was right. He hates me, right? To go in and say, you know what? Here are the issues, but maybe I didn't train you enough. Maybe I didn't spend time. What can I do differently to help you? When you go in like that, you leave them weaponless. You leave them exposed. And oftentimes, the beautiful thing of that, and it doesn't happen all the time, but what can come out of that is that other person going, you know what? You've done everything right. This is me. And then it forces them to take a step back and say, okay, what is my part of this story? So, long winded way to say, leaders who I believe have that more gut instinct, that sixth sensibility, should really read the book, because I think they're going to be the best at identifying when they fall into the trap and how they pull themselves out of it.
I cannot agree more, having read the book, Chris. In fact, I almost am certain that most leaders would resonate with the points you make, and you call out the cost of this villain trap in detail. So anyone who
Yes.
reads the book will have lots of incidents and stories to relate with, which immediately call out the cost of being in the villain trap. And one of the major costs being that we start living in an echo chamber of sorts, and it's easy for leaders when you have people taking orders from you, when people following what you want them to. So it's very easy for you not to know what's changing, and are people aligned, not aligned, are we doing the right things. The voice of the staff become silent more and more. And unless I'm reading the cues, it'll be very difficult. And this is where one of the practical challenges come up, Chris, which is it's a fine balance between silence and harmony. I've seen most harmonious team don't have much to offer, don't have much to say, because they are implicitly aligned and they feel it's all going great, there's nothing to bring up.
Yeah.
But the most misaligned teams would have the exact same behavioral traits, because they wouldn't say anything because they feel it's not going to be of any use anyway, so why say? Now, how does a leader recognize whether the silence he or she is observing is coming out of harmony or is it coming out of silence? Is someone in a villain trap or not? How does one recognize?
I love that question because it's and I talk about that. I talk about silence in the book, and what I say is, as leaders, and again, I want everybody to understand this isn't just leaders at work. You're a leader at home. You're a leader in your community. You're a leader in church, and so you're constantly leading people. Constantly, people are looking to you for guidance and all of that. And sometimes your silence says more than you realize because we're always teaching people. People are always learning around us. And silence, strategically used, can be a very beneficial tool, especially when you talk about ownership. Silence is reflective. Maybe I'm just taking a step back and I'm being quiet because I'm soaking up the information. But what I like to say is you're in a room, and I've been in many, many of these rooms, and you're talking and you ask people a question and people go silent because we've all experienced this. And nobody wants to say anything. Although you know that the people in the room know the answer and have the answers, but nobody is saying anything, and that you have to keep coaxing people out. That's a sign that something is happening. Chapter 9 in the book is my favorite chapter because what I say to people is you can say all day long, oh, I don't do any of this. I'm a great leader. But if you have been, ever were, or currently are a leader, I can guarantee you with the utmost certainty, you have been a villain in somebody's story. No question about it. And so I think in that moment, you have to ask yourself that question is, oh, this isn't good silence. This isn't reflective silence. This is silence that's saying people are afraid to speak up. And as a leader, that's where that trap begins to open, and taking a step back and saying, okay, what's going on here? Why aren't people? Because I think what you have to remember is harmony includes voices. That's really what it is. It's like if
Nice.
nobody's saying anything in your meetings, then you don't have harmony. You can pretend like you do, right? That it's just people who they're not very good, they're not this, they're not that, it's not me, I have nothing to do with it, people just aren't speaking up. But you got to remember, harmony includes voices. And I think that's a really important thing for people to remember. You want to create a safe space, which, by the way, has just gotten such a bad rap. We think safe spaces now are, these, it's kind of snowflake mentality, if you will. And that's really not what it is. It's just creating a space where people can say what they need to say without fear of reprisal. And that's harmony. And when you get that, and you can be in those meetings where there's no shortage of people raising their hand and speaking up, and there's no shortage of conflict. That's a healthy environment, right? That's where the trap can't live because you're allowing people, you're hearing people, you're understanding what they're saying, and you're allowing them to bring that to the table. Harmony includes voices. That's what I would remind everybody.
How beautiful. How beautiful, Chris. Nobody thinks about harmony in those terms. In fact, if I take the listeners through the journey, the chapter 1 of your book starts with a very personal story being recounted from your end, and then it establishes what this villain trap is. It talks about the blame bubble that we discussed. It has multiple stories and incidents talking about the cost of this villain trap. Chapter 5 and 6 are so exhaustively practical in terms of how to identify if you are in a trap or not, because it just literally lists scenarios and behaviors and things that you can literally go through check boxes and figure out for yourself whether you have gone through these, have you experienced these, and know whether you're been in before or right now are in a villain trap or not. So extremely useful for all the leaders. And while I was going through it myself, Chris, I couldn't help but think, what if I am not, but somebody else is, and I'm the recipient of, or I'm the villain in the story, and I'm the recipient of that trap in some way? So, how can we engage without getting pulled in, or worse, gaslit into believing that we are the problem? And that's the flip side of how you're calling out the villain trap.
Yeah, yeah. You remember the movie The Matrix
Yes.
with Keanu Reeves, and he's pulled out of the Matrix, right? And then he sees the world as it really is. My point with that is, if you read this book and you really allow it to sink in, when you're done, you're going to see the villain trap happening all around you because you've now been exposed to it. And you are inevitably going to see people, it could be your peers, it could be your employees, it could be senior leaders that are stuck in it. And I addressed this in chapter 10, really how you coach people out. And it's almost the same as coaching yourself out. But you have to remember, you can't beat people into submission. You can't tell people, oh, you're in the villain trap, you need to get out of it. That doesn't do any good, right? Because what happens with that, it's easy to get sucked back in to the blame bubble, to the villain trap. Because that's what your ego needs. Remember those 5 stages I talked about to identify it. One of those is justification, where I come to you and go, can you believe he did this? And you're like, oh yeah, I can't. Yeah, you're probably right. Because you need that validation. So if you're not careful, you can get sucked. The key to that is just staying rooted in clarity. It's not matching their energy. It's asking them questions that are not reactionary, but reflective. What do you think we could do differently? How can we move forward together? This isn't preaching to people to say you're stuck in this, you need to get out of it. That's when I talk about really coaching them and helping them out of it the same way you would. But you have to be careful with it, like you said. You've got to set your boundaries. And like I mentioned earlier, accountability isn't taking all of the blame at all. It's just owning your part of the story. And when you do that, when you role model that for people, it openly, like I mentioned before, it disarms them. It gets them thinking in a different way. And it can be very uncomfortable because, the saying, misery loves company. We want to be surrounded by people that validate our feeling, that validate that. And when you don't, and when you call that one person and suddenly they're not telling you what you want to hear, they're asking you difficult questions, that's where it's easy to start villainizing those people as well. So it's a delicate process, but the reality of it is, when you pull yourself out of this, when you stop villainizing, when you take ownership and accountability for yourself, you're going to see it anywhere. So you better have the tools and resources to deal with it, lest you get pulled back into it.
Oh, wonderful. In fact, enough of probing the problem. I'd love to now discuss the solutions as well. And you did briefly touch upon the solution being ownership in the earlier responses, Chris. And that's another area where I feel leadership almost has to be synonymous with ownership and accountability. That goes without saying. But the fact that this has to be explicitly conveyed as a solution means that this is being felt as wanted, not as much prevalent as it should. And in fact, one of the stories from the book, Jacob's story, the NGO story, comes to me, really stuck with me. And for the listeners, without giving away too much, imagine a scenario where there's a very highly critical, high visibility leadership meeting going on, and an NGO organization, the meeting's going on about progress of a very strategic initiative. And Jacob, one of the leaders overseeing this program, the strategic program, is being asked about a very critical stage, which, whether it is done or not done, taken care of or not taken care of. And it's almost at that point where saying no means admitting that we will not be able to deliver on time, or will not be able to deliver the strategic program, and it's a high visibility room, so almost as admitting a failure of sorts. And despite the context, Jacob openly admits the gap, immediately counts on what would be done to fix it, goes ahead and fixes it up. And that's a beautiful way of conveying how one could avoid a villain trap rather than blame the situation, own it up, get it done with, and how it all ends up building trust. And beautiful story, Chris. What if the ownership is in context of somebody who has a power center by way of designation, by way of authority, and the person in is the decision maker, who's supposed to delegate ownership, delegate accountability, and not take it himself or herself. Now, in that situation where delegation being the primary and ownership by way of delegation being the norm, how does one take care of this ownership and accountability, Chris?
That's so tough. It's two things before I answer it. I'm glad
Sure.
the story resonated with you because I think that's how we learn. We can read and you can read very practical, logical steps, but unless you see scenarios where they're applied and how they're applied, and that's why I relied on stories to tell you what not to do, and then what ownership really looks like. And I'm glad Jacob's story resonated with you because he's one of the first stories in the book where you hear him say the words, I own it. He took responsibility for it. He could have easily blamed his team, blamed other people, blamed circumstances, external forces. But what he said, I own it. This is my fault. I didn't do these things. He wasn't accepting full responsibility, but he was acknowledging his part in it because that's what he played. He played a part in it. And as a result of that, his team, you could see, I think actually the story says when he did that, his team leaned in. And that's as
Yes.
much of a metaphor than it is anything, because once your team sees you and you're role modeling this behavior of, I own it, I understand that I have a role to play, that I'm not isolated, I'm not the king sitting in a tower just telling people what to do, it really changed the dynamic of things, because all relationships are built on one thing, and that's trust. And if I don't trust you, it doesn't matter what you do. We're never going to have that right relationship. And so that's why those stories, I think, are really, really important in the book. But, you address something that I think, and I go to a lot of conferences, and I hear mid-level managers talking about, people above them, and that they're just refusing to accept the responsibility of blaming. And we see this in the news all the time, right? Where CEOs and shareholders and leaders are not taking responsibility for them. They're blaming the customer, they're blaming their employees because it's easier. The reason that happens is the higher we climb the corporate ladder, the bigger our ego gets. And the bigger our ego gets, the more need for protection, because God forbid we do something wrong, we make a mistake. It could just undo everything we've worked years. That's the story that we tell ourselves. We've been conditioned, especially as men, right? That you should never be vulnerable. That vulnerability is weakness. And it absolutely is not weakness. It's strength. It's real, true strength. And so those situations are delicate. You can't go to your CEO or your senior leader and say, you're not accepting responsibility. You have to role model it. And that's exactly what Jacob did in that moment, right? He role modeled his behavior. Team could have seen him just shirk that responsibility and blame something else, but he owned it. And eventually, if you're that person in your company that does that continually, you're not just role modeling that for the people that report to you. You're role modeling that for the people that are above you, right? And remember what I said earlier, you can't beat somebody into submission. You can't go to them and tell them all the things they're doing wrong. That just makes the trap tighter, right? You really sink into it. You've got to be able to role model these behaviors. And I have been fortunate in my career to work for leaders that do that. That is the essence of creating a safe space. Creating a safe space is letting people know that I, as your leader, I, as the person that you're reporting to, I'm not above making mistakes. I'm human. I screw up. I don't do things the right way. I say things I shouldn't have said. Acknowledging that to your team and owning that is what builds trust and credibility.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, why it resonated with me is because we've all been in these rooms, Chris, I'm sure, either as the team members witnessing a leader own up or not own up, or as a leader who's owning up or not owning up. And we've experienced this, when we know if the leader says this should have been done, I'll figure out who has missed this. And we know hell's going to break loose. Somebody's going to be a scapegoat. Somebody would be pointed fingers at. And it's just a very negative room to be in. Whereas somebody saying, I understand this has not been done. I'll make it happen. We'll work it out. And suddenly a team feels a very positive, as you rightly said, it leans in, it sees that positivity coming up and saying, okay, we'll do what it takes for the leader to get this done.
That's
And
right.
that just builds the camaraderie, the culture, the right way. And therefore can't agree more with you, Chris. In fact, through the chapters 1 to 8, we see what is the villain trap, how to the impact, and how to recognize it, and so on. And chapter 9 is the most disarming, because this
Yeah.
is where one almost through all the journal prompts and checklist recognizes that we've been in one, we've been in one ourselves. And now that we have been, what is the authentic repair for someone who has either been in villain trap before, or is currently in one, or wants to ensure that one doesn't get into in
Yeah.
future? What would the repair
Yeah.
look like?
So I love talking about chapter 9, because, and the reason that I wrote it that way is because I could envision people reading this book up to chapter 9 going, nope, this isn't me. Nope, I don't do that. Because it's
Yes.
easy. That's your ego. That's your ego saying, don't listen to what's in this book. But when you get to chapter 9, and like I said earlier, if you've been a leader, and again, work, church, wherever, I guarantee you've been the villain in somebody's stories and didn't intentionally do it, and probably will never know that you've done it, i.e. your story about Rob, which I don't want to give that away. But, authentic repair starts with owning the harm. And that's the first step, is you have to recognize it's not about whether I believe I did it, or I believe I'm right, or I believe you have to recognize that you did something that allowed this person to villainize you. And the first part of that repair is owning that out loud. It's saying, I recognize that I may have done this, or you may have felt this way because of that. Because, most conflict, something happens and I believe you're wrong and you believe I'm wrong, right? And if we go at it like that with each other, there's never going to be a moment where we're going to come together, because I'm adamant that it wasn't me and you're adamant that it wasn't you. So somebody in that has to acknowledge, I see my role. I see how I didn't do or did do this, and it caused you harm. That's the part of what you're owning. You're not owning what they did. You're just owning how you potentially came across, what you said, and how it impacted. I got it wrong. I see how it impacted you. And then committing to repair, right? Committing to say, what could we do differently? And it's not about saying sorry. And that's a misconception I think a lot of people have, that you go in and you just say, I'm sorry about that. But that's not what this is. It's about shifting your behavior to rebuild trust, because just saying sorry doesn't do anything, right? It doesn't do. Action is what really does it. And you're rebuilding trust so that you can create a safe space moving forward, that you identify with each other. And it's consistency, not perfection, that heals, right? We have to be genuine about it. Real leaders, in my opinion, don't dodge their missteps. They use them to grow, to connect, and lead with more humility and strength. Lead with vulnerability. And that's something that I've tried to do my whole entire career, is to acknowledge and take ownership for the things that I know I played a role in or a part in, because I'm not perfect. There's not a leader out there that is. And so when we recognize that what we say, what we do, what our actions, our indecisions all have some level of consequence, it could be a good consequence or a bad consequence, but we recognize that what we do impacts other people. One of the things, and this is kind of getting into, more humanity than it is leadership, I've noticed probably since COVID that we've just become less empathetic. We've become less compassionate, less understanding of people. And that is really the villain trap. If you think about it as a global thing, not just an isolated leadership thing, you've got Russia and Ukraine villainizing each other. And these are done because of these stories that are being told about the other person. It's not my fault, it's your fault. The reason we don't have X is because of them, not because of us. And to me, that's a very, very dangerous road to go down, because at the end of the day, we should all be focused on understanding each other, being compassionate to each other, and above all, loving each other, and getting away from this mentality that I'm better than you or you're different than me, because at the end of the day, we have more in common, I guarantee you, than we do in difference. And that's a really important part. And I think if I were to, really expand chapter 9, that's really what it gets to. It's be compassionate, be humble. Remember where you came from. Remember how that person might be feeling about something. And remember how your actions, decisions, indecisions, and silence affect other people.
100%. Can't agree more, Chris. In fact, the more I reflected on the book, the more I realized the impact on performance of an organization is immense if leaders are able to understand if they are in a trap or not, and ensure they remain away from it, because the cost is losing talent, being in an echo chamber, losing touch with ground realities, diminishing morale, diminishing productivity. You just can go on and on. And which is why I feel your bonus chapter is far more important here, because it's not just about organizations and in professionals, but rather individuals. Because I genuinely feel, as you rightly said, Chris, we live in a world which is becoming far more transactional now. Psychological contract or emotional contract is diminishing, not just in professional context but personal context as well. Nowadays we hear about situationships, no more commitments. So a lot of these things are coming up, and I genuinely feel if we could become more better individuals by focusing on ownership and accountability in general, then we would have a better world. And that's exactly what you talk about in your bonus chapter. So it was very humbling when I read that, when you said villain trap doesn't clock out at 5 p.m. It continues in your personal sphere. And it, because we don't stop being leaders in office, we continue to be leaders when we are at home or otherwise. So do you feel that that villain trap is something that could be identified, actioned on, and worked out in political spheres, social spheres, interpersonal, family relationships as well?
I do. And I wrote that chapter specifically because I wanted people to realize I didn't want to get typecast as this is just a book for leaders, although that's my audience and that's who I'm talking to. But I wanted people to realize that this wasn't a work thing. This happens at home. This happens with your spouse. It happens with your children. It happens when you're driving to the store, when you're interacting with people. I did an article a couple weeks ago about how the villain trap impacts customer experience, right? And just those little things. When you are having a bad day, and you're a server at the restaurant, it's easy for me as a customer to villainize you. It's easier for me to say, well, the service was terrible. You didn't do this. You didn't do that. I can't believe this. Without just taking a step back and trying to understand, I take a minute and put myself in that person's shoes. The 5 most important words in the book is what else could be true. And
Nice.
when that story starts to form, because we do this, right? You run into the server who's just a little grumpy. Maybe she's having a bad day. Ego starts developing a story. She doesn't like me. It's because of this. It's because of that. It's because of whatever. And suddenly what happens is we only see the person through the lens of the story that we've created about them, right? And that jades us because we have no idea. We've just made this whole story up. So we do that at home with our children, with our kids. And I had a friend of mine reach out who read the book, and she's got a 20-year-old son. And she said, that was the most impactful thing. I actually sat down with my son and we read that together and talked about how when I come home and I see him on the couch with his headphones and he's not paying attention, there's dirty dishes in the sink, and I've just had a hard day, how it's easy for me as a mom or a dad to just start creating that story. He's lazy, he doesn't care, he's blah, 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 whatever, without taking that step back to say what else could be true. And there's a couple stories in there that I hope kind of resonate with people when it comes to how the villain trap, we do it subconsciously every day. And the other thing was, and I mentioned, and I opened with this, and I'm very public about this. Look, I loved my dad. He was a good man, but he villainized everything. He never took accountability for anything. And as a result of that, that shaped his life choices. And unfortunately, he died at 54. I'm 54. Right. And so that's a very powerful thing for me. And then that got passed on to my brother, who did the same thing and unfortunately committed suicide when he was 32. That's what living in the villain trap will do for you. It leads you down this very, very dark path. It minimizes our ability to be compassionate, to be humble. And so if nothing else, buy the book and read the bonus chapter, because I think that will have a tremendous impact on you at home and in your personal life. So it's an important chapter. I'm glad it resonated with you. And that is my hope, that it's not just people reading this about how to be better leaders at work, but how to be better leaders in general.
Wonderful, wonderful, Chris. In fact, I had a very different question in my mind to conclude our conversation, but after hearing all your responses, I can't help but ask you something entirely different, which is if you were to think of how the world's shaping up today, it's extremely transactional, and almost it's as if the implicit understanding is that we are all bound to each other by an expectation of a specific transaction. I give something to get something. There's a give and take. There's a in professional context, there's a clarity on KRA KPI. You report into me to do this, that. And in such a context, what do you think would be the right goal for anyone to read this book? What should be their key takeaway in context of a highly transactional world we live in? But there are 3 different thoughts coming into my mind after listening to you. One is the transactional world we live in, which is the context. The other is the need for a highly engaged, personalized, human to human engagement interaction, devoid of ego, devoid of insecurities, but rather focused on clarity and engagement interaction. And the third being the villain trap itself. How do we get boxed in it and the cost that it has?
Yeah.
How do we all connect all the 3 together? And given this, what should be the goal for anyone while reading this book?
Yeah. And I would say, I think ultimately as leaders, wherever you're leading, I would say presence over performance. And what that means is that my role as a leader, I may be measured on KPIs and metrics and goals that I have to achieve, but as a leader, that means is I'm not doing that. I'm working with a team of people, and I'm trying to motivate and guide and coach and nurture them to execute whatever I'm reviewed on, whatever that KPI is, more revenue, more sales, whatever. And I think we've lost that. We've lost this ability to lead from a human perspective where we understand that we're not doing the work. It's the team that's doing the work. And I talk about this a lot, 35 years in retail. And I say this, and if you follow me on LinkedIn, I say this in my posts all the time. Whatever company you're shopping with or going to or using, you will probably never, ever meet the CEO, the COO, the CMO, the C team of that company. But you will meet Sally, the person that's working the cash register, or Bob, the young guy that's stocking. Those are the faces of these companies because they make the company go. They make the flywheel spin. And I feel like we have forgotten this in on our transactional nature. And what really bothers me is, and I just responded to an article from the Wall Street Journal where companies I think the title was, they're not playing nice anymore, right? They're saying, look, if you don't want to do what I tell you to do, go get another job. Right? Like anybody will want to work here. If you don't want to come in 5 days a week, forget you go do that. That's transactional. That's a leader not putting themselves in the shoes of the people that are making the company go, right? And we have to get back to a place where we recognize that, where these senior leaders who are making millions and in some cases billions of dollars, while the people who are making the company go are making $15 an hour, we've lost the humanness, the connection, the presence to understand is I need to be taking care of you because you're the one bringing customers in and making people happy and doing all the work. I'm just here to coach you, guide you, and nurture you. My last company, I was the CEO. And one of the things that I love to tell my team is that I am the least important person in this company.
Wow.
And they would say, well, no, you're not. You're the most. I said, no, I'm the least important person in this company because I don't have my hands on the things that are making the company go. So it's in my best interest to make sure that I'm doing one thing, and that's listening to what you need to be better and giving it to you and nurturing you and guiding you and doing all this. Why do you think companies like Target and Starbucks, these tenured companies, are struggling? It has nothing to do, I'm telling you, with these tariffs and this other, is they've lost connection with the people who run the business. And if they don't get back to that, right, then I'm not too sure what's going to happen to those companies. I like to say great leaders don't pause to wallow, they pause to align. And I think that's a really, really important thing for senior leaders to understand right now. If you want to get your company back on track, reconnect with your workforce, humble yourself, let yourself out of that villain trap where you're blaming all of these people for everything, own your part of it, rebuild trust, and watch your business grow. That's what I would tell those people.
Well, I couldn't have asked for a better ending to our conversation than the passionate appeal you just made. Chris, I echo that appeal, and I almost wish that, with your book and the mission that you're carrying with the book, I hope we get to have more efforts added in to make this a better world and our organizations better organizations. So thank you so much, Chris, for your book, for the wonderful insights, for the recommendations, and the wonderful appeal you made. Really appreciate your time and availability on the podcast. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a great conversation. Thank you.